We're dumping money down toilets. One of the most bastardly, I think, definitions in the world, which is harm reduction.
Welcome to the Restorations Podcast. I'm Caitlyn McKenney, and this is a space to talk about what's happening in our cities when it comes to politics surrounding homelessness, addiction, crime, and mental illness. I'm really excited to share with you today my conversation with Ginny Burton. Ginny is a former drug addict and convicted felon whose life was radically transformed in prison, and now she's an advocate for recovery and life transformation. This is her before and after photo that went viral and kind of launched her into the public sphere. I've already learned a lot from her, but before you hear from Ginny, let's talk about two things currently happening that you should be aware of. In case you missed it, there's been a lot brewing on social media and in the news about a program in San Francisco for homeless alcoholics. And apparently the city has been spending somewhere between $2 and $5 million per year on an old hotel building in the Tenderloin where nurses will give shots of vodka and bottles of beer to people who are on the streets in the throes of alcoholism. Besides the fact that I think this is completely antithetical to the practice of medicine, it's also bad policy. And it's the same bad policy that insists that providing drugs or drug paraphernalia to addicts is a way to save lives and steward city resources. We have seen the results of this harm reduction policy play out, and we know that neither of those things are accomplished. Enabling addiction, whether to hard drugs or to alcohol, is a deadly use of city resources. And there's something particularly disturbing about picturing a person whose health has been wrecked by alcoholism, walking into this government building and being handed vodka by a government-paid nurse. And I'm glad to see on social media that the vast majority of people agree with that. Okay, King County released their 2024 point-in-time count of homelessness, and it's not looking good. There are now an estimated 16,400 people experiencing homelessness in King County. That's up 23% from the previous number, and almost 10,000 of those people are unsheltered, experiencing homelessness on the streets, with a 28% increase in unsheltered homelessness since the last count, which is huge. Now, here's something really, really interesting. The King County Regional Homelessness Authority oversaw the point-in-time count and put together the report on it. And their conclusion, immediately following their report of a significant increase in homelessness, is that, and I'm quoting from them, "It is important to recognize that homelessness is an outcome of structural racism and racial inequities." They show us a graph right below this statement that breaks down the homeless population by race and compares the 2022 numbers to the new 2024 numbers. And if you're watching this, you'll see on the screen, Indigenous population, no change in homelessness. Asian population, 1% increase. Black population, 2% decrease. Hispanic, Latino population, 7% decrease. Islander, no change. White population, a 10% increase in white people experiencing homelessness. We could argue about how or if racism explains why 6% of King County's population is Black, and yet 19% of the homelessness population is Black. But I think we can all agree that the statement that homelessness is an outcome of structural racism is really hard to mesh with the fact that the only racial group with a significant increase in homelessness was white people. 16,400 people experiencing homelessness in King County. They could have said all kinds of things in this report. They could have said our current policies are obviously not solving this problem. They could have said all of the money we're putting towards this is obviously not solving this problem. And instead they said, this is the outcome of structural racism. And I think that tells us almost nothing about the state of homelessness in King County, and it tells us a lot about the people in charge of solving it. Now let's hear from Ginny Burton, who knows homelessness and addiction firsthand and might surprise you with some of her thoughts. Welcome, Ginny, to the Restorations podcast. Thank you for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, Caitlyn.
Yeah, of course. First, I want to say it's an honor to have you here and be able to sit down and have a conversation with you. I've heard pieces of your story and learned a lot from some of the content that you've produced. So I'm excited to learn more from you today and think that your voice is really, really important on these issues.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Can you start by giving a brief overview of your life, the experiences that you've been through that have brought you here today, and what you're doing now?
Yes, I will give you the elevator version.
Yeah.
I was born into an addict family, not knowing that because I was a small child, was introduced to drugs by my family members at a very young age, watched my dad go to prison when I was really young, and didn't really realize that was setting up the foundation for the rest of my life. I was an Excel student, and I had big plans to go to law school at a really young age. However, my life took a very different direction. Not until I was probably in my 40s did I realize that my life I was studying the law, but it was from a different perspective. A number of years later, almost 30 years of addiction, a life of crime and incarceration, abandoned children, and everything of the like that comes with that kind of lifestyle. I found myself being arrested and facing a fourth prison term at the age of 40. And that is when I knew that I was being rescued. I knew that it was an opportunity for me to turn it all around, and that's what I did. And so for the last almost 12 years, I didn't just focus on turning my life around and changing my life. I started to see that there was a tremendous amount of need in the world. I was serving in social services, and a lot of the people that I got the opportunity to serve were people that I knew and people that I had used drugs with. But I felt like I was not able to serve them effectively. I wasn't able to help them to get to where I am. And so my life's mission has become to change systems and impact policy to help individuals get from where I was to where I am. And I don't think we're doing that today.
I think your story is really important for people who are suffering from addiction or in the throes of addiction, to be able to look at someone who came out of that so successfully and has such a beautiful, successful life, is empowering and encouraging. And I think it's also really important for people like myself who have not had a personal experience with addiction or with many of the things that you've been through. I'm 24. I think my life probably looks so different than yours did at 24, just vastly different. I can't even imagine. And I think your story is really powerful for people like me, too. I think sometimes people in that group who haven't had the lived experience that you've had fall into kind of a trap of thinking that because we haven't experienced those things, we can't speak on them or we can't have a position on them. And I don't think that's true, and I doubt that you do either. What do you hope to see people like myself have the life experiences that you do with your story or in response to your story? And how do we navigate the stories of people with lived experience that maybe have different outcomes or different takes on things, without just surrendering to, well, whatever Ginny says, I'll go with that, or whatever, then this person's saying something totally different, I'll go with that.
Yeah. Well, first, there's this, there are a lot of words that the meaning of them have changed and morphed over the last number of years. And so the label of lived experience, it's sort of vastly broad, right? I like to really qualify my lived experience as somebody who lived in the throes of not just addiction and incarceration, but a multitude of things, but who has come out on the other side of those things. And so for somebody that's wanting to use my story or to leverage the things that have been beneficial to me, I would encourage them to, really sort of scrutinize anything really that I say or anybody says based on, where were we and where are we now, if that makes sense. And so, do we see where a person is living at today and how do you see that person living today? Have they overcome the challenges that cause them to participate in areas of life they didn't necessarily want to or that weren't necessarily serving them, right? So I think a lot of the issues that we have in our world today is that we're looking at lived experience as we're going into, let's just take encampments, because I think they're one of the most broadly accepted new sort of environments in our especially our metropolitan cities, but in our communities today, we go in and we say, I'm talking to these people with lived experience. And so we're talking to people that are living in tents and things like that. And so where the challenge comes, right, with using, because people always align me with people in addiction or people in homelessness and things like that because of my experience. If you would have come to me when I was using and in a tent, I would have given you a laundry list of things that I needed. They're vastly different from what I would tell you today. And the reason being is because when a person is driven by their addiction, their needs are very self-centered. And so they're going to drive, that list is going to be driven by the needs that they have in that current moment, right? And so I am personally separated from my highest self when I am under the influence of drugs. And so I think that what I think people really need to take a look at is when they look at an individual or other individuals with lived experience, are those people living outside of the throes of their circumstances, the circumstances that had them in submission to something? So I don't remember the second part, but I feel like it was kind of aligned.
No, yeah. Just navigating other voices, like so many voices with lived experience on these issues.
Yeah, and so that gives me, I'm glad that you asked this question. It's something that comes up for me a lot lately. So I have a lot of friends that I know from 12-step recovery. And so 12-step recovery is abstinence-based. A lot of us, specifically in the city of Seattle, move from, working in whatever jobs we get into when we first get clean to moving to the social service structure. And that structure is very vast, right? We're talking about housing first. We're talking about outreach on the streets. We're talking about recovery or, treatment centers. We're talking, behavioral health. All of those different platforms kind of mold into this sort of one social service structure, label. And a lot of us live a very different kind of life than the way that we serve others, if that makes sense. And so we live a life based on abstinence and zero tolerance for ourselves. However, we're kind of feeding people from a spoon that has a different kind of nutrient in it, so to speak. So I always find that interesting, and sometimes I try to have conversations with some of my friends that work in that field, especially the ones that very strongly advocate for services, for example, harm reduction services, helping a person get on methadone and keeping them suspended under the influence of methadone and really being a champion for the methadone program, even though they didn't practice that in their own life. For example, because when a person's under the influence of methadone, and this might seem a little tangential, but I think it's fitting for the topic. When a person is under the influence of methadone, they are as imprisoned, I think is the word that I want to use. They are as imprisoned as they were when they were on fentanyl. If, in fact, the relationship with fentanyl or heroin has severed, because it's allowable, right? So I always find it somewhat challenging, which, whatever an individual chooses to resonate with or participate with, if you choose to, be a person that has a lived experience of overcoming addiction and living in abstinence and then serving others what I would consider to be rotten fish. We have a large part of our population that sees fit to do so. So I say go with your spirit. I say if it feels right, if you see a person who is really pushing for an improved quality of life of individuals when it comes to us being spokespeople for change, then I say go with that.
That's
if
great.
That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I love that division between in lived experience in the throes of the suffering and the struggling versus on the other side when you've come out of it. And the methadone thing, not a tangent at all, is actually going to be my next question for you. A while ago, I watched your video where you interview a friend in Seattle who I think you had experienced addiction alongside a long time ago. And she's been on methadone treatment for 13 years. Yeah. And that was a really eye-opening interview and video for me. Totally confronted what I thought methadone was and how it was used. Can you explain just the basics of methadone treatment or other opioid medical treatments, and then your opinion on it? I would really love to hear more about that.
Gosh, this is going to be like my favorite interview ever. First of all, we have to recognize that methadone itself is a synthetic opioid. So I have a 22-year-old niece who died last year from a very low dose of methadone. My sister's only child
Accidental?
Accidentally.
Okay.
So I believe it was 25 milligrams that killed my niece. My niece was a marijuana user. I think we have misconceptions that, and I want to say this again, methadone is a synthetic opioid. There are a lot of misconceptions. I've literally done ride-alongs with police officers who were under the impression that methadone doesn't get you high.
I also saw that in a recent video of
Okay,
yours
you
where the
saw one of
police,
those. Yes,
where the police officer was like,
Yeah.
"Oh well, methadone doesn't get you high." And
Yeah.
the gal
And
who was, I think, using it was like, "No, it does."
Yeah, and so just a little bit of an example about that. So when I was strung out, everybody's seen my side by sides in the red jumpsuit. I weighed about 89 pounds. I'm 5'9", by the way. I weighed about 89 pounds there, but I would get regular infections when I was under the influence of drugs because I wasn't healthy. I mean, everything that was going into my body was a narcotic, and so I didn't have any sustenance going in. So it was very easy for me to get an infection, and sometimes the drugs that I was putting in my body were dirty. So when I would go into Harborview, and I have a scar on one of my eyelids, I went in one time, I had an abscess that had formed on my eye. I would get traveling infectious abscesses on my body. And so what they would do when I would go in is they would put me on high doses of methadone so that I was so loaded that I couldn't leave the hospital. They were afraid that I was going to lose my eye on that one occasion. But other occasions they were concerned that I would end up becoming septic and then dying. So methadone is used, to really inhibit a person's ability to do things sometimes. And so
when they were putting you on methadone in the hospital, it wasn't to try to start a treatment process for addiction.
It was to make sure I couldn't leave the hospital.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so, which, I'm sure partially also make it so I wasn't dope sick. But they were much less concerned with people being dope sick back then than they are now. Everybody is so concerned today with keeping people comfortable, but we're stilling their opportunity for change. And I like to say we're stealing their spiritual path, but that's a whole other conversation for another time. Back on the topic of methadone, so, I think part of the process of methadone is so that people aren't uncomfortable, right? When we stop a person from being uncomfortable, we stop them from recognizing the challenges with the decisions that they've made. Yeah. So we take away their connection with their personal choice, right? And so methadone clinics really aren't in the business of, and also, they're being paid per dose. So when they're being paid per dose, and I only know, not because I've been told this by other folks, but I have some folks that work for the methadone clinic that I'll interview eventually, but prescribers and clinicians that I have talked to that work in the methadone clinics, they're paid per dose. So they're not really incentivized to have people stop dosing. No. And 13 years, honestly, that's not that long. I have a friend who's been on methadone, or was. I think that she has safely been off, but she was on methadone for 32 years.
Wow.
She was one of my best clients that would buy coke and heroin too. So methadone isn't used to try to help anybody improve their quality of life. If we look at the side effects of long-term methadone use, we see kidney failure, we see heart problems. People don't die from natural causes. People's quality of life doesn't improve. Sometimes over time, we might see people stop shooting dope because their veins are gone, but not usually because they are prohibited or discouraged by the methadone clinics. As you heard in the episodes, you heard that they're open to continue to use street-level narcotics. And I just want to say, too, there's a misnomer that methadone protects an individual from overdosing on fentanyl. Where are we getting the data from this? Because it's a synthetic opioid that can cause overdose on its own. Anyhow.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, there's not a lot of incentive, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like when I worked in social services, one of the things that I recognized was that if the beds aren't filled, if we're not meeting the numbers, then we get dinged on funding. And so, for example, if we didn't have full capacity in the shelter when I worked for one of the largest nonprofits in Washington State, then we would lose a specific amount of funding in the next quarter. So if we don't think that folks aren't incentivized by funding, I think we're sadly mistaken. And, and any one of us can look. If methadone was a solution, we would probably see less homeless people right now strung out on fentanyl.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. It's a powerful interview. I encourage anyone watching this to go watch it. I'll link it or show it up here, but just heartbreaking to see this, your friend, and the effects,
and
the
she
obvious.
was gorgeous, by the way. I want you to know, when we met, she was a beautiful girl. And not that she's not still a beautiful person, but she
so
has aged significantly.
Yeah.
Significantly.
Yeah. And that she would just keep going to this clinic, and they would keep, I mean, it's just, it feels so twisted to think of the people working in these clinics not wanting anything better for their clients, or keeping them kind of sedated on this drug. It really changed my view of methadone for sure.
And that's why I'm telling these stories, because we have the narratives and then we have the truth. And I know the truth, and I could be out there singing, from the rooftops all day, every day, but then I'm going to become one isolated voice that is the opposer of the system. And I'll tell you, I mean, when I left social services, I left on good standing. I still had good relationships. I think I've been, given a label maybe in the social service arena, but I mean, at the same time, I don't know. I still have good relationships, but a lot of the folks that I know that work in the industry, from the methadone clinics all the way to Housing First, they're not comfortable with what they're doing. They're not comfortable with the service that they give, but they have bills to pay. A lot of them are one paycheck away from being the next, homeless person. And a lot, it's really actually quite interesting. It makes me, and I say this a lot lately, is that it's like the mafia. You have folks that are willing to do away with the many to appease the few. They have this very strange loyalty to these organizations. I don't understand it personally.
It's fascinating. I liked what you were saying about keeping people in a place of comfort, and I think that's it's an interesting view of kind of the philosophy of harm reduction, or keeping people comfortable so they're never awake enough to see what they're in. Curious if you've heard about this. Has been going around in the news lately. What's been happening in San Francisco, where a government-run program being publicly funded, I think it's about $5 million a year for the last however many years, to provide alcohol, literally shots of vodka, beers, to people who are alcoholics on the streets in the Tenderloin in San Francisco, in a hotel building in the Tenderloin that they've purchased, where they have nurses giving alcoholics vodka.
I worked in a building like that here in Seattle.
Similar, alcohol.
They're called wet buildings in Seattle.
Yes, they have them.
They're in the Housing First structure.
So your reaction to that, or thoughts on that, as another facet of the harm reduction, keeping people comfortable.
And to be quite honest with you, when we look at it from an alcoholic perspective, it's one of the least comfortable things you'll ever witness in your life if you ever have an opportunity to see any of these kind of environments. It's actually quite sad, especially late-stage alcoholics are... A lot of them aren't even mentally present anymore. They just know that they need the alcohol, and you feed them their disease. You feed them their disease, and they defecate, and they vomit, and they urinate all over themselves, and they're an absolute mess. But it is really indicative of what we're doing with things like Suboxone and methadone. We're doing the same exact thing. And we're squandering money. We're dumping money down toilets. One of the most bastardly, I think... definitions in the world, which is harm reduction. We're not reducing the harm for anyone.
Yeah.
I mean, we're reducing the eyesores to an extent on the street, but we're not looking at the individual that we're serving in any of these environments. Do they have children? Where are their family members? Because I'm certain they didn't just hatch out of an egg and end up where they are. What have we done to recognize or identify their family members or the things that have been important to them? Out of the thousands of people that I served in social services, I would say upwards of 96% of my clients didn't like their circumstances. And not that the other 4% did. They were kind of career transients, and I don't even know if that's the right word to use, but we used to have a lot of drifters back in the days, or before this thing became what it is today. But the majority of my clients didn't like the circumstances of their life, but they had no idea how to get out of them because they had been caught in the maze for so long.
Yeah. I appreciate your perspective on this so much. And to loop back kind of to what I was saying earlier, we both went to UW. I feel very, very familiar and comfortable with kind of the dominant perspective among my peers there. I'm sure you saw it too. I think a lot of it has to do with, we ask ourselves, like, how could people give alcoholics alcohol? How could people keep someone on methadone for 13 years? And I think what I see among people my age is this, like, we don't want to judge, or like, we haven't experienced this, so whatever keeps them comfortable, whatever they think is best for their lives, whatever, their best choice for their path for themselves is, even if it requires me to, like, keep them in something that I couldn't imagine for myself. Did you see that during your time at UW? And how do you see yourself as kind of confronting? I think your story just confronts all of that head on, and that's why it's really powerful.
I mean, well, this is the interesting thing, right? I, too, was falling victim to that indoctrination. It's an indoctrination is what it is. And when I worked in social services, I didn't really understand that that's what was going on. But when I went to UW, I was like, oh, this is where it's starting at. So it's starting on university campuses, honestly. And so, in the research study echo chamber rooms, right? Where you're not leaving the school to research the things that are happening in society, to actually learn about individuals, but you're writing these papers and et cetera, but I too was victim to that indoctrination when I worked in social services. And one of the common things, and this is how I think it happens to people with lived experience, is that I had this long history of failures in my life, right? So I saw what I had done anytime I look in the mirror. I didn't really see the value of my lived experience. I didn't really understand that, my experience and my ability to come up out of some of that stuff had any power. And so, you kind of look at yourself dualistically, right? Well, I don't make good decisions, but they do. So, I must do what they do, right? In order for me to be okay. So it's like, oh, I'm going to listen to them. So when I was working in social services, there were all of these messages about, well, this is what we do, and this is how we care for people, and this is the right thing to do. And so I was like, oh, well, maybe if that would have happened for me, maybe my life would be different. But as I stayed in the field, it didn't take very long at all for me to say, instead of being a little bit envious that didn't happen for me, saying, oh my gosh, I'm so grateful that never happened for me.
Yeah.
Right? But then you get into this position where, well, this is my job. Right? This is my job. This is what I'm trained to do. And then you sort of get into this sort of unconscious othering. And you look at people differently, even though, but for the grace of God go I, right? So then I get onto the university campus, and I start to look at, in my first year, and I was a transfer student, but my first year, I'm like, oh, they're brilliant. These young people are immensely brilliant, so maybe they do know more about where I come from than I do. And then George Floyd happened. And I was like, these people don't know what the hell they're talking about. And it just took that uprising, because I was being asked to be a spokesperson on some of those topics with some of the stuff that was going on. And I was like, oh, I'm not your girl.
Yeah.
Because I'm from the ghetto. I am from low-income housing where I was the only white family in my neighborhood. And I'm like, I don't support a lot of the ideologies that are going on. I think it causes disunity. I think it separated us. And so, and that's when I really started to understand my power. But I really think a lot of this is feel-good ethics, young people who don't want to disturb the stuff, and then we have educators. And this is the way I look at it. If you haven't been to hell, you don't know how to navigate your way out of it. We're not allowing enough people with lived experience who really have come out of it, not based on the indoctrination and what the system says, but based on our own journey, who live very oppositely of the system, even if we work within the system. We haven't learned to value ourselves enough and to be a dominant voice, and there aren't enough people coming and talking to us about what needs to be different.
Can you share a little bit about your thoughts and perspective on law enforcement? That's another issue where people my age at UW, not about that, but you have a very different perspective.
Yeah, well, first I perceive that that's indoctrination, right? Because even though we say we don't want cops involved, who are the first people that we call when something gets a little bit scary? It's 911. If it were not for police intervention, I wouldn't be sitting here today. When an individual is removed from their destructive path, specifically through the vessel of incarceration, it gives an opportunity for clarity. So a person is in jail for a little while, and the first thing that happens when anybody is in jail is that their mind starts to clear. Because typically substances are involved with any kind of police engagement on in most circumstances. But, once they're separated, then they get an opportunity to have clarity, and they usually want to change their lives. And that is when the most effective opportunity for service intervention can be implemented. And when I say services, I'm not talking about medical assisted treatment. So, really, we need to reinvigorate our law enforcement's ability to arrest, and we need to expand funding on incarceration and implement necessary programs, which I personally have done. I'm under contract with the Department of Corrections, and I'm doing exactly that to collect data in the Washington State Department of Correction prison facilities. I feel like everybody's heard this. People want to do away with and abolish incarceration. That's the worst idea we've ever had.
Yeah.
That is the worst idea we've ever had. That doesn't mean that we've used the tool effectively, but I want to say this, it is a tool. And in order for us to see people improve their quality of life, we have to give them the skills to make that happen. And we're not doing that. And so I always like to urge people, what would you do if it was your child? Mm-hmm. If it was your kid? Because if it was your kid, you're gonna be a little more strict than you are with what's going on. Making somebody comfortable because bad things happen to them because, oh, you poor thing, and somehow taking on the responsibility of that does not help that person get to a place where they have agency over their own life.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, I hope more and more and more people continue to join you on this. Yeah. And I know that they're there, and they might be in the background and they might not be speaking out yet, but it's so powerful. It is absolutely a head-on confrontation to this kind of pervasive ideology that's ruining lives and destroying lives.
It is.
And so I so appreciate you for speaking out and for being a testament to that.
I just want to say one little thing. It's not just destroying lives, it's destroying the fabric of our nation. When we prioritize helping other countries over helping the people that are dying in our streets, that's a huge problem. We're breaking down the structure.
Last question is, how can people follow you and your work and stay up to date on just the great content that you're producing?
How people can follow me. You can follow me on social media, V as in Victor, Ginny Burton, V Ginny Burton. You can find the docuseries that you're referring to, Modern America, on YouTube. I have a website, www.vginnyburton.com or www.o-ut.org.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you, Ginny, for joining us today. So appreciate it. Wow. I hope you feel as strongly as I do after listening to her that Ginny Burton is an incredibly needed voice in our culture right now. As we're told by the people around us that people are a product of their circumstances, Ginny is proof that people are so much more than their circumstances and are always capable of change. As we're told that the loving thing to do is make someone feel comfortable and accepted exactly where they're at, Ginny is proof that it's in the moments of discomfort, not comfort, that radical life transformation can happen. And as we're told to accept the dominant, pervasive narratives of our time about addiction and law enforcement, Ginny is a bold voice of truth, even when that truth is extremely unpopular. I hope more people with stories like hers come forward and speak out, and that all of us are emboldened to put forward truth with confidence into a culture that so desperately needs to hear it. Thank you for listening to and watching this episode of the Restorations podcast. I'm excited to keep bringing you different perspectives on the issues facing our cities. Please subscribe or follow wherever you're listening so that you don't miss the next episode.